Hello, Royal History Geeks. You are here today for a slightly strange, or perhaps a more positive way would be to say a bonus episode of our monthly Royal Roundups. I'll explain what we're going to do in a minute, but let me introduce myself. My name is Gareth Streeter, and I am the creator of Royal History Geeks, and I am joined by.
James Taylor, Royal Commentator.
So, as many of you may know, last month we launched the first of our monthly Royal Roundups, where we reviewed September and everything that happened that involved the royal family, which was quite a lot, as those of you that listen to it will know. Our plan was to come back at the end of October and to do the same, which we have done, or actually, if I'm completely honest with you, we will do after we have recorded this episode, where we will have an episode looking at the royal month that was October. However, it will be apparent to all of you listening to this that the big story of October has been around the continuing role of Prince Andrew in public life. A statement has been made to that effect this month, and it is likely that more will happen in the next few weeks. There have been many other significant royal events over recent weeks, so we wanted our October roundup to capture and give due attention to those. As a result, what you are listening to now is a special episode looking exclusively at the Prince Andrew situation. And as a result, I won't go as far as to say we won't mention him at all in the October roundup, but that will not be where the main focus of the conversation is. Hi, Royal History Geeks. This is Gareth here speaking to you from the future. When James and I recorded this podcast, it was on the 25th of October. By that time, we knew, as we'll be talking about on the podcast, that Andrew had voluntarily relinquished the use of the title Duke of York, and it was already becoming clear, although not announced, that he was likely to be leaving Royal Lodge. Since then, on the 3rd of November, the King has officially stripped Andrew of the titles Royal Highness and the title of Prince, and it's become clear that he absolutely will be leaving Royal Lodge and going to live in Sandringham. As a result, a lot of what we're saying on this podcast is out of date. Regretfully, we didn't have a chance to re-record it this weekend due to other commitments, but wanted to get the podcast out. So we thought the best thing to do was to allow the podcast to continue as previously recorded, but just to have me beaming back from the future every now and then, just to give a little update. So, James, first of all, how are you?
I'm all right, thank you. Although it's been a busy time with not only with the number of royal events, but also particularly with all this Prince Andrew business rumbling on.
Yes, very, very busy, and a time which I think is one of those times where, for us as enthusiastic commentators and observers of the royal family, the exciting thing, if you like, and I think some will think I'm a little perverse for using that term, but I'll explain what I mean after. It's one of the times where lots of people in our daily lives who are not normally the least bit interested in our passion for royalty start engaging and asking questions about it, and all of a sudden you become someone people want to speak to about it. But that, as interesting as that might be, that is of course really dampened on this occasion by the fact we're talking about something in the context of some pretty horrible accusations and some pretty horrible revelations about a member of an institution that we generally speaking, want to see celebrated. So I think there's been so much that's just come out the wash over the last few days. It would be quite helpful to just take a step back and review where the drama that we've witnessed recently has come from and what the history of it is. And James, I know that you are quite expert at generally the movements of all the news around the House of Windsor. So would you like to give us a quick plotted history of this saga?
I will do. And of course, it is an opportune moment to say that, of course, all of the things that we're going to talk about are one quite harrowing
Mm,
and do involve talk of sexual assault and violence against women. But also, we must mention that Prince Andrew does deny all of the allegations that have been made against him, and I'm sure that's something that we will return to. So, if we think back on in 2019, there had been a lot of accusations about Prince Andrew and his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein and with Ghislaine Maxwell. And in that November, on the 26th of, sorry, on the 16th of November 2019, there was an interview broadcast with BBC Newsnight with Emily Maitlis, in which Prince Andrew denied ever having met Virginia Giuffre, or Virginia Roberts as she was then. He claimed that he was not present on the date in March 2001 when he was alleged to have had sexual intercourse with her. He said that that was the night that he'd gone to take his daughter, Princess Beatrice, to a Pizza Express in Woking. And he also said that the photograph that was produced of him with Virginia Giuffre, that he had no recollection of having met her and that it may have been fake. So after that interview was published, 4 days later, on the 20th of November, and there was an announcement from Buckingham Palace that he would give up any of his public engagements for the foreseeable future, that he was not going to be working on behalf of the Queen and would not carry out any further engagements. And that situation where he was still formally a working member of the royal family but was not acting as a member of the royal family continued. Although I will preface this by saying that this is late 2019, just as we were heading into COVID. So there are very few members of the royal family actually carrying out public engagements it, on the public stage for the next couple of years anyway. And so then by the time of January 2022, we were just heading into the late Queen's Platinum Jubilee year. And there was another announcement made from Buckingham Palace in that January that Prince Andrew was formally stepping back and that he was no longer that he was relinquishing his military appointments and any charitable patronages and presidencies that he still maintained. It has to be said that several had already dropped him as president or patron before then, but this was the time that he formally relinquished it. So this is when he stopped being colonel of the Grenadier Guards, for example, because we'd seen him ride at Troop in the Colour for the previous few years behind his mother's carriage and standing proudly on the balcony of Buckingham Palace next to her following her birthday parade. So that was, for him, I'm sure, was a big step and a humiliation. And it was then in that year that we also saw that the announcement was made that he'd settled out of court with Virginia Giuffre because she had brought a case against him, a civil case against him in the American courts, and he had settled. Now the figure of £12 million is often quoted. I'm a little bit dubious about using that figure, not because I don't believe that it could be true, but simply because it's never actually been confirmed by anybody. I think that it's one of those figures that has been used and then is often quoted. But it is fair to say that he did settle for a substantial amount of money with her out of court while still denying any wrongdoing. And he did not appear during the Jubilee, but he did appear at the late Queen's funeral, and he had accompanied her earlier in the year at his father's memorial service too. Since then, we have seen him appear at Christmas at Sandringham and also at Windsor at Easter. And for the last couple of years, his wife, Sarah, Duchess of York, as she was at the time, has also appeared with him. And it must be said that she has remained quite a popular figure amongst royal enthusiasts. So there's been a lot of sort of cheering and waving and whatever to see her. But Last Christmas, he didn't appear at Sandringham because there had been the implications in the whole Chinese spy story, which is a completely separate story, but was felt that that would overshadow the royal family attending Christmas at Sandringham, especially given that it was the first appearance of the Princess of Wales at Christmas since her illness, and also the King too. However, he was at Windsor this Easter. And then towards the end of last week, there had been lots of stories, speculation about him because of Virginia Giuffre's posthumously published autobiography, which was released this Tuesday. It has to be reminded that Virginia Giuffre did die earlier this year. She died as a result of suicide, so was not alive when the book was published. But in the book, it makes several more detailed claims and allegations about Prince Andrew and about his alleged sexual activity with her. So last Friday, before the book was published, Buckingham Palace announced that he was formally that he decided not to use the title of Duke of York any longer, or His Royal Highness, nor would he be using any of the honours that had been granted to him. So he was Knight of the Garter. He was also a Knight Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order. So we won't see any of those. And indeed, his Garter banner has been removed from St George's Chapel, Windsor, this week. And it was also announced that Sarah, Duchess of York, his former wife, who he still lives with in Royal Lodge, is no longer going to use her title either. She is simply going to be known as Sarah Ferguson. It must also be said that their decisions do not affect their daughters, who will still retain the titles of Her Royal Highness Princess Beatrice and Her Royal Highness Princess Eugenie. So they are not affected by this. And of course, their children don't have titles because the titles wouldn't descend through the female line in any case. And then also in the last week, there's also been a lot of talk about him living in Royal Lodge. And there was the investigation by the Sunday Times about him living there rent free, which I think in fairness, one should point out that it's not quite as simple as him living there rent free. He was subject to a contract which had been signed 20 years ago, in which he did pay a substantial amount of money, believed to be about £8,000 up front for renovations to the building. And the clauses of that contract do specify that he has to carry out regular maintenance, regular upkeep, and it's not as simple because it is a listed property. It's not
It's in the
just as simple
millions,
as
wasn't it? The figure he paid, rather than you said 8,000. It was in the
sorry,
millions,
£8
wasn't it? Yeah.
million.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
sorry, £8 million, and it was also it was part of that lease is that he is required to carry out the upkeep of the property. And it's
Mm.
not just as simple as slapping on a coat of paint as it would be in any other house. It has to be done to a certain standard and using certain materials, which are more expensive than would be for anyone else. You couldn't just nip down to B&Q or to any other DIY store and buy a pot of paint to be able to do that.
I think. But that's a very helpful summary, James, because I have to say I'd slightly lost track of the timeline on all of this myself, and I think it's probably worth just digging in a bit to your summary, which I think you said, but certainly from my point of view, as a slightly more casual than you, but still less casual than most people observer of the royal family, it really was that 2019 Panorama interview, wasn't it? Where I think there's
Newsnight.
really Newsnight, sorry,
Mm.
Newsnight, where really came really to public attention, and I think that the public decidedly took against Andrew from that moment. I think it'd be fair to say in the way that he was deemed to have conducted himself during that interview.
Indeed. I mean, I'd been asked about Andrew and his association with Epstein on local radio, well, the best part of 10 years before that. So it was not that the story was not known. And certainly at the time that Jeffrey Epstein had been imprisoned, when he was released from prison, and then when he well is reported to have taken his own life by suicide in prison too. All of that meant that there were headlines and adverse headlines about Prince Andrew and about his association with him. So it's not fair to say that no one knew, but those things did seem to, blow over fairly quickly, and as the news agenda moves on, that something else would happen. I think it was the fact that he gave that interview, which automatically made the headlines. But not only that, the way in which he answered it, answered the questions that he was presented with. Because I've heard a lot of people say, well, surely he should never have given that interview. It was a bad thing to do. I'm in two minds about that because, on the one hand, I can see why people would say that, and indeed it did end disastrously for him. But at the same time, I think that if he had come out in that interview, he'd explained things, he'd shown remorse, then people, and he could have still kept a distance, still denied any wrongdoing, but have come out of that better than he did. I think it was the way in which he approached it
I
that really
agree.
did it for
I
him.
don't think the interview itself was a bad idea. And actually, because I remember watching this at the time and speaking with people the next day, and actually 70%, 80% of that interview wasn't that bad. There were bits of it that actually he came across all right. The two fundamental clangers was when he said he still didn't regret his relationship with Epstein, was the one, and the second was when he described Epstein's actions as unbecoming. And I think those two absolute clangers of a mistake both just horrified people into thinking this man doesn't get this at all, but also made him look very detached and like he did not understand the consequences of what had happened.
So we know that Prince Andrew has given up the use of the title Duke of York, although he's not been stripped of it, although there are calls of it for that to happen. Could you give us a little bit more of an overview about the titles, how they work?
Yes, I think it's just worth because there's understandably people have been confused, and the announcement was pretty ambiguous itself, as royal pronouncements on titles often are quite ambiguous, actually. It's worth taking a bit of a step back to understand a little bit more about how royal titles and noble titles in general work, which helps us understand what actions actually happened and what potentially could still happen. So, broadly speaking, titles in this country, and particularly among the upper nobility, fall into two categories. There are peerage titles, which are effectively legal pieces of intellectual property that a peer owns. They are a legal creation, and a peer has a slightly different legal status, both in terms of privileges and restrictions, to an average citizen. Those are titles like Duke, Earl, Marquess, Baron, Viscount. I just listed them all, but not in order, actually. And so Andrew, as Duke of York, is a peer, and that is a peerage title with legal significance. Not very much legal significance post 1999, when hereditary peers lost the right to go and sit and vote in the House of Lords, but nevertheless with a tiny amount in existence. Those titles are given by the king, but they cannot be removed by the king unilaterally. It requires an act of parliament to remove them. There are then also another category of titles, which actually I called courtesy titles in the post I did on it. And someone called me out on that because, technically speaking, a courtesy title shouldn't really be enshrined in law. And some of the titles I'm talking about are. So that was perhaps the wrong word. But the phrase I would call them would be sort of honorific titles, things that sound nice and make you sound quite important, but don't have any real legal consequence. They don't, in and of themselves, convey any precedence. They don't convey any legal privilege or any legal restriction. And those are titles like Prince, Princess, His or Her Royal Highness. Lord or Lady, not in the way it's used by peers who often call themselves Lord or Lady, but the way it's used by the children of more senior peers. Like if you look at Downton Abbey, the Earl of Grantham, that's a peerage title. His daughter, Lady Mary, that's just an honorific social title. It has no real consequence. Titles that are in this honorific category, the king can just unilaterally remove by one of several legal instruments that's available at his disposal. So by Andrew saying he's not going to call himself the Duke of York, he is still technically a duke, and he's also an earl and a baron as well for anyone that's counting, and those titles do technically remain. However, there's also an understanding among people that observe titles, among in Britain and among the Commonwealth, that the king is the arbiter of how we all style ourselves. So even if someone is a duke, if the king says, "I don't want you to call this person a duke anymore," as faithful subjects, we obey, and it would be improper to call that person duke, even though legally they are, which is why for most people's money, it makes more sense to do things in the way that they have done it, which is that the king asked us not to call Andrew Duke of York anymore, and we all faithfully observe, rather than wasting parliamentary time putting a bill through Parliament, which wouldn't really change anything anyway. I've noticed there's been quite a lot of conversation, which I completely understand, saying Andrew can't have the title of prince removed because that's his birthright. That is not strictly speaking true. It is his birthright in the sense that the regulations set out in 1917 bestow the title of prince on all sons of a sovereign, but there have been examples in history of the monarch actually intervening to stop somebody having that title as well as just not using it. So where it possible, where it's considered appropriate for Andrew to be removed of his princely title and formally removed of his style of Royal Highness, that is something the king can do.
No, and he could also stop calling himself prince if he chose to as well.
Yes, yes, he could, and interestingly, there are examples in the 20th century, in the early part of the 20th century, where there were two princesses, Princess Maud, sometimes called Princess Maud of Fife, and Princess Patricia of Connaught, who both either decided or were encouraged, we'll never truly know, at marriage to cease using their titles as princesses and to just be known by the status they would acquire from marriage, effectively, or in the case of Princess Patricia, she would be known as Lady Patricia thereafter. In the case of Princess Patricia, an order of precedence was actually, oh, sorry, a warrant of precedence was actually issued to formally convey that the king was, at her request, removing the style of Royal Highness and the titular dignity of princess. In the case of Princess Maud, it was simply done by common usage. There was
Mm.
no formal proclamation. And that just shows that even within a few years of each other, there's quite a lot of flexibility among among royal decrees as to how things are managed. And it's tempting for those of us that pore over the detail to assume that there was some distinct policy difference in these cases, but there might not be. It's just there's a
No,
fluidity.
and that fluidity, I think, is shown by the fact that even though she had stopped calling herself Princess Patricia on marriage in 1919,
Mm.
Lady Patricia Ramsay did appear at the coronations in both 1937 and 1953, wearing the ermine of a princess and
Yes,
princess coronet,
exactly.
um, and that Princess Maud, um, even when she was known as Countess of Southesk, was gazetted at the time of the George VI being in northern Italy during the Second World War, and she was appointed a Councillor of State. That she was gazetted as Princess Maud, Countess of Southesk.
Yes.
So I think that that shows that there was that level of
Yeah.
fluidity there. For if I think that you could argue that that's because she was carrying out a position of state as opposed to living as a private citizen as she was the rest of the time.
Yeah. We know there are two things on the horizon. One is that MPs are involving themselves with this. The second, and this is connected, is there's a big conversation going on and potentially some news coming soon about whether Andrew continues to reside at Royal Lodge. Let's dive into the political aspect for a minute because this is something I'm very worried about. Because this is a funny thing with the British Constitution, in that it is absolutely right for the government to involve themselves in this issue. The Prime Minister is the chief advisor of the monarch, and that includes
Well,
issues
that's
of
why he's the prime minister, isn't it? That's
exactly,
how that title
exactly,
came about.
and as we know from the Abdication Crisis series that we recorded at the beginning of this year, that includes advice about your family. It is not these things are not cannot be separated in the way monarchy works, and but Parliament having a role is quite different. And my big worry is if Parliament decide, perhaps for quite populist reasons. There's nothing wrong with being populist. People should, the population should feel the benefit of the rules that are made on their behalf. But if MPs decide to bring forward a bill and pass a bill that strips Andrew of his title without Andrew having asked him to do so, then Parliament have effectively pronounced sentence on a man who has not been given due process. Now, I know people are going to say, and they will be right to say, but could it not be that the system is unduly protecting Andrew, therefore the system needs to unduly go in the other direction to correct that? I think it is an incredibly dangerous thing in a democracy to have Parliament bypassing due process and punishing somebody in law by legally changing their status when they have no criminal conviction. That's very different to what the King's been doing, which is working behind the scenes to at least extract Andrew's, I no doubt, reluctant blessing to give Andrew a role in doing it. And I think that's a very significant difference. What do you think?
I agree. I think that one thing that we have to remind ourselves of is the fact that not only has Andrew never been convicted of an offence, he's never actually been charged of one either. He's been accused, he's denied those accusations. And so I think that then to put a bill through Parliament to deprive him of his titles would be, from what we know, excessive. If there were calls for him to face a public inquiry, then I think that would be something which is quite different, and I think
Mm,
that that's something that you could support. But the I suppose the only other thing I would say is that, as has been made clear in the publishing of Virginia Giuffre's book, that Prince Andrew did commit to assisting the authorities in the US at the time of his accusation, and he failed to do so. So he has failed to answer questions. So one might argue that in not doing that, he has not given himself, he's had the opportunity, he's had the right to reply, but he's not taken it. I'm not saying that I think that that means it's right for him to be stripped of his title necessarily. And I do think that it's not necessarily the best use of parliamentary time when so many bills fail each year because of the lack of parliamentary time. But nevertheless, I think it is fair to say that he could have spoken out before and could have defended himself publicly, but
yes.
has chosen not to.
In everything we're talking about, Andrew is he has been his own worst enemy, and he's pretty much responsible for all of it. It's difficult to think of something he couldn't have done worse than he's done in terms of the handling of it. So it's not so much that I have any sympathy for him personally. And it's not even that I particularly have a problem with him being stripped of his titles without him wanting to be stripped of them. It is Parliament choosing to sit in judgment over somebody and enacting that judgment in law, passing a law
Mm.
to confer a judgment on someone when that has not been tried in a court. I think it is going back to it is a medieval act of attainder,
And
and it
also
is a
what
hallmark of a
yes,
democracy that can't
true.
happen.
And what kind of precedent would that set? Although I do think though that we're still a long way off from that happening. I do realise that there are lots of calls and more calls, but I do think that without any disrespect to our MPs, a lot of them are not experts in constitutional matters, nor experts in styles and titles. They hear a lot of chatter
Mm,
from constituents saying, "Oh, we hate that Prince Andrew. We ought to do something about him."
yeah.
It's very easy to call for something for that to happen, but much more difficult to be able to put the wheels in motion for it to happen.
My only real point is I think, and I am going to go on about this because I think that we have let some things happen constitutionally in recent years because they just didn't seem important, like it was a detail that didn't matter. And without meaning to, we've actually, and I know this is going to sound heavy-handed, but we have legislated away bits of our freedom. And I am worried that Parliament intervening to sit in judgment is such a constitutionally difficult thing to happen that it could have consequences that people don't foresee. However, I have thought of a solution for all of this, which I'm going to share toward the end of the episode. So I've not just deconstructed, I have reconstructed as well.
But I would say as well that if there were bill through Parliament to deprive him of his titles formally, then the question that I would also ask is what might that mean for the Sussexes? Because there have been constant calls for that to happen to them too. Now, I know that Prince Harry would and indeed did say in Spare when he was talking about having his security removed, well, we weren't accused of anything as bad as child sex offences, and that his supporters would say that all they have done is talked about their experiences in the royal family. But it still has to be remembered that they are no longer living in the UK, but yet are still using those stars and titles, and indeed insisted on using those stars and titles for their children. But there have been calls for them to be stripped of those titles. And if there were action taken against Andrew to do that, I do wonder whether there might be a momentum for that to happen for
There
them as
might
well.
be. I do think the situations are very different, and therefore you could
Yes, I'm not trying to
defensively.
relate them at all because
No.
they are very different. And but even so, I would still say that the fact that people have been calling for that for them
Yes,
as
you
well.
and that and the royal family have always been careful about, creating slippery slopes. So if you give this to people, they'll then be paying for this, and they've always been very good at managing that. I think with the case of the Sussex, I mean, I'm really not a major fan of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex and the decisions they've chosen to make. But even I don't think it's a comparable situation in terms of that, Andrew, even if he is innocent of the specific accusations that would be deemed criminal, I think has shown such bad character in a way that sums up the worst that royalty could be at its most corrupt. I think he's such a well.
Well, I
The
mean,
the
the thing
problem
is,
with the
even if
Sussex is
yeah,
they almost want to work harder and in a different way than the royal family can allow. And I think they were perhaps naive, thinking they could do that within the royal family, and they could have just gone off quietly and done it without creating all the fuss and having all the ill feeling. But I don't think that they are corrupting the positions they've been given, you know,
no,
to create evil in the world.
no,
Well, quite. I mean, the last time that ducal titles were forcibly removed were by people who fought against this country in World War One. So that sets the bar. Now, I just do not think you could put the Duke and Duchess of Sussex in that category. Now, the Duke of York has not fought against the country, but I think he has been treacherous in the sense that I think he has abused the implicit contract that a member of the royal family makes with his or her country. And if we put this in a historical setting, the medieval the medieval nobility, actually, it wasn't a sense that they believed that they had their nobility by birth and therefore they could do what they liked with it. They did believe they had it with by birth, but it was also believed that that nobility had to be earned. So if you were born with nobility, you must then earn it back through using your power and your privilege and your prestige in a noble way, which is why they're called the nobility. Now, of course, history is full of examples of members of the nobility that did not do that, but that ideal was useful. And I think in our implicit contract with the royal family, we recognize they are born to, in many ways, immense privilege. We also recognize that comes with some immense restrictions and some immense difficulties. But what we expect is that they work to varying degrees to earn that back through service. Elizabeth II is obviously the archetypal example of that.
yes, and of course, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, quite famously referred to that as devoir, was one of her known catchphrases that she would refer to that as the duty that one pays for the privilege that one has.
Absolutely. And that is, I think, what people look for in the royal family, even if they wouldn't articulate it that way. I don't think they really mind. They live in palaces, but they expect. So, which is why you see just people go to sort of almost ridiculous levels of appreciation for the Princess Royal, because, well, as you would tell me, James, she'll often be in three different parts of the country over the course of a day, and she's in her
Well, indeed,
70s.
she indeed only this a great example of that this week. She was in London in the morning, in Yorkshire in the afternoon, and in Scotland in the evening.
Hmm. Exactly. Let's talk about Royal Lodge quickly. So, as we started to talk about the finances of it all earlier, and so the story that has been dominating this week is that Andrew has only paid a peppercorn rent since for the 20 odd years that he's lived there. This is an issue of government, of parliament. This is the Crown Estate is basically taxpayers' money. Andrew's been ripping off the taxpayer. Quite a few things I think wrong with that analysis. I think Margaret Hodge describing it as publicly owned assets is a limited comparison. The Crown Estate, by agreement, is something that the sovereign hands over the proceeds of the Crown Estate to the government. So anything, I suppose, that is kept back and not maximised to its full is money that could be spent and on the taxpayer, for lack of a better term, but it's not quite true that it's a public asset. And the second distinction, as you pointed out, is that actually, I must say, one thing I didn't realize peppercorn rent literally meant you give over a peppercorn, like you pay a peppercorn. I just assumed it was I didn't know I just something that was little is sort of where I thought it had come from. But actually, is the arrangement really that Andrew is in is much more like he has bought a long lease. That's
Yes.
much more like because if you buy a long lease on a property, as you were saying earlier, the upkeep falls to you. You basically own it, but just only for a period of time, you and your descendants. If you just rent, and I've been a renter in the past, you're not expected. You pay a monthly sum, and you're not expected to do the upkeep. You're expected to keep it decent and tidy and not damage it, but it's the landlord's responsibility to manage the upkeep. So whatever the technicalities, it sounds like Andrew is paid somewhere between 8 and 15 million for the long lease, really, on that property, rather than he's been squatting there, living there rent free.
No, and I think as well that in the story it's been embellished as to just how luxurious Royal Lodge is. I
Hmm.
mean, it is a very large house, and
I think it
it
looks
is.
horrible. I think it looks like the worst kind of 1950s hotel that you used to have to stay in at work events and hated it.
Well, bear in mind the Queen Mother lived there for years and would not allow any of it to be refurbished or not
Right,
allow any, you know, uh, she. I mean, I've not Royal Lodge is private, so I've never visited there, but I have visited the Castle of May, and if you see there are still scratches on the carpets where the corgis had been that the Queen Mother would not allow it to be reupholstered, and
right.
chairs that she wouldn't allow to be reupholstered and things like that. And apparently it was the same at Royal Lodge. But I think as well, which is not in any way trying to say that Andrew
Mm,
doesn't live in great luxury. I'm simply saying that I think that it is exaggerated as quite how luxurious it is. And the story often goes between 30 rooms and 30 bedrooms. And I think it does actually
right,
have
right, right.
close to 30 rooms in total rather than 30 bedrooms,
Mm,
or certainly reception rooms. So I think that again, one has to be careful about that. And I think that as the story is told, it's embellished and makes it sound as though it
mm,
is. I mean, it is a very large house, and I'm not trying to say that it's not luxurious.
mm.
I'm simply saying that I think that as people who have an axe to grind against the royal family
Yeah.
get involved, the story is exaggerated and
Mm.
exaggerated much more wildly. And I think that one has to be careful to keep to the facts, which is what I always try to do, because I always think that even though I am somebody who's always supported the royal family,
Mm.
I'm not here to be an advocate for them. I'm here to speak to the facts, and then it's for other people to make
Yeah.
up their own minds.
I agree. I mean, I am an advocate for the monarchy, but I think it's so important that the supporters of an institution are among those that offer criticism, because otherwise you're enlisted criticism from people who don't support the institution. Whereas
Well, quite.
what we offer is constructive criticism because we want the institution to
Well, I
continue.
hope as well that it's more informed and that it's also more reasoned. And that's because if
Mm,
you do your research properly and your due diligence properly, then you're able to offer a much
mm.
more reasoned
Yes.
debate rather than simply going, no, well, he didn't ought to be living there. He's why is he squatting there? Why is he living there rent free? Well, actually, when you look at the nuances of what, as you've described that it's more like a long lease situation
Mm.
rather than a rental situation, then I think that does make a difference. I'm not arguing he should carry on living there, and I could see the advantages of him moving out, but I think that there would be far more
Well,
reputation than there would be
I
in
am
any practical
arguing.
use.
I'm going to go on a limb. I am arguing that he carries on living there, and let me tell you why. Because I think. By the way, I'm not sure he will carry on living there. It does seem as if there's going to be a movement to get him out. But at the end of the day, at the moment, he's living there. Everyone knows he lives there. So although there could be media stories saying, "Oh, and he still lives there and we hate it," there's not wherever he will have to live somewhere. So wherever he lives, there is going to be an angle that where he is living is more luxurious than he deserves. And because the way royal finances work and are very hard to disentangle what's private and public, there'll always be an argument of, and it's you paying for it, even if that's not really, strictly speaking, true. So it just creates a whole other tranche of stories when he settles wherever else it is he goes. But the other thing I would say, and this is far more important, is that at the moment they know where he is and they can see him, and he's basically under house arrest, admittedly, in a very, very, very nice prison. If they cast him out altogether, as you said earlier, James, he's always going to be the king's brother. He's always going to be the son of Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in history. There are going to be people who do not have the best interests of the United Kingdom at heart who are happy to give Prince Andrew or Andrew Windsor, Andrew Mountbatten money. And if he is left to the mercy of people who do not have the UK's best interest at heart but are happy to pay him, who knows what he might end up doing, how loudly he might sing for his supper. Now, I don't think he knows the nuclear codes or anything like that, or any closely guarded state secrets, but he knows far more, I'm sure, than we would want getting into the hands of a foreign power. If nothing else, as a former naval officer and trade envoy. So I think leave him a Royal Lodge where we can see him. We know where he is. There's no new scandal associated to it. And just please don't let him out.
Well, that's true, I just want to point out when I say that I don't particularly want him to stay there. I don't mean I want him turfed out in the dark necessarily. I just mean that whether he lives there or whether he lives, say, on a corner of the Balmoral estate, it's the same ends as where he is, and he's being you know taken care of, if for want of a better expression. But what I mean is that for me, it makes very little difference where exactly he lives, because he's still going to be the king's brother, and all of those things that you just said. So, and also, as you just said, whether he lives at Royal Lodge, he could move out into a smaller house in the Windsor estate. He could move to. I mean, there were reports that he was going to move into Frogmore Cottage, which was recently vacated by the Sussexes. Well, people would still say, and that which is much smaller than Royal Lodge, but people would still say that's far more luxurious than he deserves. And I think the
He's
other thing that you
anywhere's going to be more luxurious than like any house you or I have ever lived in, aren't they? I mean, it's
Well,
just going to
even
be.
well, the thing is, even if he were to move to a two up, two down, which I can't see
Yeah.
happening, but if he were to move to a two up, two down, people would still say it's more luxurious than he deserves because of what he's been accused of. So
Yeah.
you couldn't get away from that, no matter where he went.
And
But I
and
think,
moving him will create a new scandal wherever he goes. So if he were
well,
moved to
there's
a
also
corner
the
of the
cost of
Balmoral
moving,
estate,
apart from anything
well,
else.
exactly, which will be
That
headlines.
that's
So
not going to be free.
Move him to Balmoral, and the SNP are going to go nuts. They're going to be like, "Oh no, you can't put your dirty laundry in Scotland. That's outrageous."
No,
Think of the
because this is
protests if he now moves. This is why I'm saying leave
yes.
him where he is. If they move into a flat in, say, Clarence House, then there's going to be stories about, well, think about what the central London property value of that is and multiply that by this or that, and Sadiq Khan will get
Well, he
involved.
did
And
no, and he did previously have a flat inside Buckingham Palace.
mm,
So if he were to go and base himself there full time,
then they'll have moved
that
him to the heart of the royal operation. That's what I mean.
exactly.
That's the scandal.
I don't
He's
think
then
there's
been
any
brought
real
into the
way out of
fold.
it.
There's no way of it, which is why I say
No.
just leave him where he is.
And of course, with Royal Lodge being on the Crown Estate, if he doesn't live there, you can't just move anyone in there
Well,
either, because it has to be somebody with the correct security clearance and all of those things. And so I think that again, that's I I when in all of this, I do question what people want to achieve. I can see why people want to see him humiliated, but I think that just wanting to see him humiliated is not necessarily a worthwhile motive in itself.
I don't think people, I don't think the national security implications of cutting off Andrew have even crossed people's minds, and I think they're very real.
Yes, I think that's fair.
Hello, future Gareth here again. As I said earlier, by the time you're listening to this, it is now clear that Andrew will be leaving Royal Lodge and he will go, we believe, to live on the Sandringham estate. The reason that Sandringham is significant is that the Sandringham estate is unambiguously the private property of the king, rather as an individual, rather than property that is in any way linked to the crown. In fact, if Charles chose to, he wouldn't have to leave the Sandringham estate to William when he died, although, of course, he will. And in fact, Edward VIII, when he abdicated, didn't initially surrender Sandringham to his brother George VI. He had to buy it. George VI had to buy it from the former Edward VIII at a reasonably considerable sum. So it is unambiguously private property, which does not detract from criticism potentially that the monarchy is still sheltering or harbouring Andrew, but does at least protect them from the accusation that they are using taxpayer funded money to do so. I think that a lot of the conversation you've just heard between James and I, well, or between James and past Gareth, is still very relevant. I think you, as you could tell, we were heading in that general direction in terms of what we were recommending. I think the point I make about how there would be considerable protest wherever he went. So is it perhaps easier just to leave him where he was? I think, to be honest, that still stands. There is now talk of protests in Sandringham, but I can certainly see the logic in a way I perhaps had not fully appreciated when we were talking about having Andrew live somewhere which is unambiguously private property. Therefore, he is at the gift of his brother as an individual, or living, I should say, the grace of his brother as an individual, rather than as a beneficiary of the British state. Anyway, I'll let you get back to the past with James and past Gareth. We've already done this really, but let's move into an analysis or our thoughts on on how this has all played out. One of the things I think has been telling is that there is almost, I don't think I found any sympathy for Andrew as an individual in any quarter. And I think that is telling. I listened to quite a lot of right wing or right of centre podcasts, which is where you might, and it's interesting how these conversations about Andrew be dominated the political, not just sort of royal, but political as well as lifestyle podcasts and stuff. And it's interesting that this is where you might have expected for there to be a bit of support about, well, this is terrible because this is the trial of public opinion. This is someone being hounded out when we don't, when we don't really know all the facts, because that's the sort of thing that might get raised on those sorts of podcasts. But there is no sympathy for him whatsoever.
No, and I think that that's because he's seen to have brought it on himself. Because even if he isn't guilty of any
Mm,
criminal wrongdoing, he's certainly guilty of immorality, certainly
yeah.
guilty of dishonesty. And because he had the opportunity to give evidence in
Mm,
America, but then chose not to,
mm,
there's also the question of, well, he had the opportunity to give his side and to do all of that, and yet has chosen not to do that.
mm,
So
mm,
I think that again, any sympathy that he might normally have elicited, he's lost, and he's lost through his own actions, really. And
mm.
it's difficult to have sympathy for somebody who has got themselves in that situation as a result of
Yes.
not only acting in a way. I mean, I would say if he's guilty of anything, it's gross stupidity and of perpetuating that stupidity. But I would
Well, he's
also,
guilty of that at the bare minimum, isn't he? I suppose.
well, yes, but I would also say, well, I do then wonder, what people expect from him, because I think I've said this before. Every time he is pictured leaving the house, if he's pictured in his car or if he's
Mm,
pictured riding, the headlines always have some variation on "Embattled Andrew breaks cover,"
yeah.
and I do question, well, is it really is it realistic to expect him never to leave the house again? And that's where
Yeah.
I do. I'm not saying I want him to live a particularly happy, luxurious life, anything like that. But I also think, is it any of our business if he chooses to go out nip to the corner shop to get a pint of milk or
I
whatever it
I
might
think
be.
I think people's sense in the sort of sense of natural justice is because most people do accept that someone who's done something horrific and admits to it and spends 20 years in prison, when they come out, they do sort of accept they're going to have to go to the shops. People do recognize you've got to be practical. But the difference I think people would say in that situation is they feel there's been some punishment dished out. And I think what everybody is trying to do with Andrew, because he's never going to get convicted of anything because there isn't really now going to be evidence beyond two different people's words on something. Because getting legal punishment for Andrew is unlikely, I think what the royal family have really been trying to do is kind of say, well, what would seem an appropriate level of punishment without a conviction that would enable people to feel they can draw a line, move on, and then recognize he's going to have to go to the shops. And that's very, very difficult to do. And they've tested the waters a bit with the statement, removal of the Duke of York title, further isolation. William's been very clear he will not be at the coronation when William is king. But I think although I think the king handled it brilliantly by getting it to be Andrew's initiative, by getting a clear statement, by enabling people to use it as another opportunity to criticize Andrew, I don't think it seems that it's not going to be enough, that people want more.
Indeed, indeed. And I don't think you're ever really going to get away from that. And also, I don't think you'll ever satisfy everybody in it either.
Do you think any of the media coverage has been unfair of recent days on Andrew? Do you think there are any points that can be made in his defense?
I don't have any points in his defence. I mean, I did mention that I did think that to call him a squatter is not, but my point on that is more that it's not factually accurate
Yes, yeah, yeah,
rather than me having any real sympathy for him. I think it is difficult to have sympathy for someone who has brought themselves to where they are by their own actions.
yes,
And
yes.
there's a difference between saying he deserves the coverage he gets, but saying that I understand why he's getting it. And I think that because he had action in a way which was certainly in that interview came across as
Mm,
quite arrogant and came across as uncaring and unfeeling, that and the fact that he has then failed to make any other statements since
mm,
then means that you're basing your opinion on him on what he said
mm.
either in that Newsnight interview or what has been released officially since in statements. It's very difficult to have sympathy for somebody who does not come across as showing any real contrition or sympathy, and
Yeah.
also who, and I think as well because the nature of the offences, because when you're talking about somebody who is very very powerful, who is very rich, is from a very powerful family,
Mm,
and that you are then contrasting that against someone who was trafficked, who was treated poor.
mm,
If you read Virginia Giuffre's book, which I've not read all of it, but I have certainly read extracts from it, it is a very sad,
mm,
very
mm, mm.
harrowing story. She was sexually abused as a child. She alleges her father denies, but she alleges that she was sexually abused by her father as a child and by others as a child, and that she then went into
Mm.
the employment of Epstein via Ghislaine Maxwell, and that they not only were they was there that coercion for her to perform sexual acts on not only on Andrew. And I think actually that is something that I would say. I think it is rather unfair that all of the attention is on Prince Andrew when it was a much bigger story than that, and lots of other powerful
And
people who were
there are
who were
certainly
who were
others that
exploiting
are
it.
hiding under the sea of coverage around Andrew.
Yes,
Yeah, I
yes.
mean, I agree with you about, and I've got no personal sympathy for him at all. The only thing I think I've seen the last week, which I thought slightly unfair, is like you, the finances around Royal Lodge, which are a little bit more complicated than people have made them. And the second thing, there's been quite a lot of talk about how, and I understand this, but basically saying Andrew has made no contribution to public life and has no sort of discernible skills or merit. And when he was the UK trade, what was he, trade envoy or trade ambassador? I can't remember what his title
Well, I
was
think it
now.
changed during the time, but yeah, a
Right.
special representative for trade, I
Especially,
think it
yes,
was.
and that had no merit whatsoever. Actually, the reality is that the governments, both a Labour government and a Conservative government, did actually think he was quite good at that. He was a nightmare to work with, but they actually thought he was quite effective in that role. And I've got friends who've been PR people at various charities that Andrew's been a supporter of, and apparently he was always very good at like getting money in. And I think he's quite a good salesman, actually. So, and I only say that not because that in any way is any kind of moral sort of balancing of the scales, but I just think it's so important that when someone's done something terrible and evil, we don't increase our understanding of what a human being is by assuming that their whole life can be free of any merit whatsoever. Because it's a way of, I think it's, we do that as a way of protecting ourselves, saying, well, I've got some good things in me, I could never be evil. And
Mm.
actually, we have to recognize that even among people's evil actions, there's still a human being who's capable of both.
Well, I think that the problem is that we live in such a binary society. If somebody is either good or they're evil,
Mm,
and there's no nuance and there's no in between, even evil people can have carried out good actions during their lives in the same way
mm.
that a broken clock is right twice a day.
Yes,
So I
yeah.
think that in doing in doing the looking back over his career and saying, well, he's never contributed a thing, I think
Mm,
is like you say unfair. And also I think that as a second son as well, you might compare him against the king and do that unfavorably, but again unfairly because
mm,
not the same as expected of him, and he wouldn't have had the same opportunities. But I do think though that if you compare him, say, to the Princess Royal, and even
mm.
say to the Duke of Edinburgh, who the Duke of Edinburgh had quite a rough
Yeah,
start to his
yeah.
public life. In two ways. Firstly, when he left the Marines, and secondly, with the business over his
Mm,
television career. But nevertheless, both of them did then go on to carve out successful
yeah,
roles
yeah.
in public life, which I don't think Andrew did to the same extent. And I think part of the problem of that is because working as a special representative for trade,
Mm.
that was not so much a public facing role
No,
as one which was which was involved a lot of overseas travel, which people
yes.
then complain about. Oh, he's always
Miles
jetting off abroad.
Andy.
Yeah, but if you're doing that as part of your work and you're
Yeah,
doing that to bring in money for UK PLC, and also the fact that people don't then tend to see the benefits of it necessarily. People in government would see the benefits of it, but people, just ordinary members of the public wouldn't necessarily see that the
yeah.
benefits have been brought in by not just Andrew, but other people working alongside him. But
Yeah, yeah.
nevertheless, would see that. So I think that when people criticise him, and there's a lot of
Mm,
criticism
mm.
of Andrew and Felly. But I think that with that, I think you have to remind yourself that the role in which he was carrying out, you can't compare it to the
Yes,
roles
yeah,
carried
yeah,
out by his siblings because it was a very different type of
yeah.
role.
And it's intriguing. It's interesting as well that he was asked to take on that role by a Labour government. So and I don't think the Queen had sort of insisted that they do, and that even if she had, there's no reason they would have done it. He was then kept on in post by a Conservative government. So they had, even people across the political spectrum had seen that he was doing something valuable in that, and it could very be he could have been very honourably discharged with at the change of government in 2010 if there wasn't seen to be a need for him. Let's take a step back and look at what this means for the monarchy, because I have to say, although I think the king has handled it well and there's been lots of favourable comparison, I'm afraid I think this does represent a dangerous moment for the monarchy, and I was wondering what you thought.
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, I was asked in an interview that I did on the radio the other day, is this
Mm,
the biggest scandal that's facing the monarchy? And I said, well, I don't think it can be called that because it's nowhere near on the scale of the abdication crisis.
yes, yeah.
And that's no reflection on any support for Andrew as an individual, but simply
Mm,
that if you have the king being forced to give up his throne, there are far bigger political and constitutional ramifications than the brother of the sovereign being involved in something scandalous. And even if it were criminal, which at the moment it isn't, but even if it were, that's still
mm,
the ramifications for that are nowhere near as big
yeah.
as someone being forced to give up the throne. So no, I don't, and I think that you have to keep a sense of proportion. Nevertheless, I do think it is a very big scandal. I do think that it does reflect badly on the rest of the royal family because how can it not?
Well, I think there's two ways There's direct and indirect. Look, we'll come back to the direct in a minute, but the indirect problem, or the, if you like, the existential problem, is the argument that I was making earlier in the pod about whatever we think about Andrew, he'll always have been Elizabeth's second son. He'll always therefore be a danger if he gets into the wrong hands and becomes on the payroll of hostile actors to the UK. That could very, which I believe, I think it's very important that we're pragmatic enough to look at things from that prism. But I could understand why someone would say, well, hang on a minute. If what you're saying is we have to put up with his bad behavior to some extent because it represents a national security threat, maybe we just shouldn't have princes and maybe we just shouldn't have kings. And I can understand, I don't believe that, but I can understand why people would get there. On a more direct problem, I suppose, is the nature that the royal family are guilty by association because there seems to be, and I don't understand this, I don't know if you've come across this, there seems to be some sort of accusation that he couldn't have been legally served papers because he was in Royal Great Lodge, so the law enforcement agencies or lawyers couldn't get to his gate and therefore that he was therefore sort of legally protected. I don't know if you've come across that. It sounds
Yes, I
very
have come
bizarre
across
to
that.
me. Sounds
Yes,
very
I have.
bizarre.
I've read that. But also, members of the royal family are not above the law.
No.
They can be served summons. They can be compelled to give evidence. They can be charged.
Mm,
I mean, the Princess Royal famously had to attend court because of a
mm,
dog of hers had attacked someone else's as dog in Windsor Great Park
mm.
nearly 20 years ago. The Duke of Gloucester had um, was convicted of a speeding offence. I'm not trying to equate either of those with what Andrew has been
No,
convicted of,
but it serves the
charged
legal
of,
principle. Yeah.
sorry, is being accused of here. I'm simply saying that members of the royal family have in the past had to answer to
Yeah.
criminal proceedings.
Yes, they have. And that's why I didn't quite understand this point. And perhaps if anyone understands exactly what the point is, they can explain in the comments. But the idea that I've seen some Americans saying online, oh, now that Andrew's not a prince, does he lose his diplomatic immunity? Well, he'd never had diplomatic immunity. Princes have never had that. So, but that sounds like it's something that gets reported in the US, perhaps inaccurately. But this idea that people couldn't move against him legally is not correct. Now, I'm not naive. I recognize things happen behind the scenes, and I can understand that some people wouldn't want to move against somebody who was deeply connected into the British state. But there is no legal reason, strictly speaking, why they shouldn't. I think, though, that as a result of him still being at Royal Lodge, which, as you know, I think he should remain. There is an accusation he's being harboured. I just don't think they could really, and I think that's what William is probably very sensitive to. But I don't really see how they can, because although a lot of people I've heard this week have been saying he should go into exile overseas. Well, he's still that's still an argument that he's being protected. He's being rushed away.
Well, I think wherever he goes, the argument is that it's going to be protected. I mean,
Yes,
because wherever he goes, it'll be a case of, well, he's still being given advantages that other people wouldn't. And
yeah,
so I think no matter where he goes, no matter what he does, I still say that I think the best thing for him to do would be to go quietly. But not necessarily. But when I say that, I don't necessarily mean in terms of location. I mean in terms of
yeah,
going, keeping his mouth shut, not and
yes, yes,
causing as
yes,
little problem as possible. But whether that's on the Windsor estate, whether that's at Balmoral, whether that's abroad, I don't really have any strong views on. I just think that when people are calling for him to be evicted or whatever,
yeah,
you need to ask yourself what the motive is and what you're going to achieve by calling for it. Because as I've said before, he's always going to be the king's brother. So
mm,
there's always going to be questions of what does he know, where is he, who's he involved with, and all of that. And also because he has never actually been charged or convicted of an offence, I do think that it does make it, as you said, quite dangerous to suddenly
mm,
start taking legal proceedings against
yes, yeah,
somebody without a criminal conviction. I think if you
yeah,
were to have, a court of inquiry or something like that, then that's something which is quite different to try and establish
yes,
the facts.
absolutely.
But even with that, what are you going to achieve with it, and what are you going to do
Yeah.
with that afterwards?
Well, I think so. And at the end of the day, it would be for the American authorities to bring a case of prosecution.
Hmm.
And I think, and we'll come on to talk about this, I think what we just need to make clear is that if they ever wanted to do that, Andrew is not protected in any way by the British state. I feel sad that how the impact this has on Andrew's daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, because you correctly said at the top of the pod, James, that there is no change in their status formally. They are their Royal Highnesses, they are princesses. I think that had there ever been any chance that Beatrice and Eugenie would become working royals, and who knows whether they'd even want to do that, but there's certainly a need for more working royals of a slightly younger generation. I think it's now pretty impossible because probably through no fault of their own, these two girls are going to be guilty by association, not just because of the sins of the father, but realistically, we don't know how much money their parents got from Epstein. But it's certainly, according to Andrew Lawney, and I don't know if he's correct or not, it's much, much higher than the figures that have been banded around in terms of the estimates. And it's therefore highly likely that some of it will have been spent on the girls, just because that's what happens, and
Yeah, and I
therefore
think
they're
it's
tainted by just that
yes.
possibility.
I think that the fact that they're not currently working members of the royal family, I think, does work in
Yes.
their favour in as much as the fact of they they're not being seen to benefit publicly from it. Any charitable work that they do in a
Mm.
private capacity.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, and so, yes, you're right. I do think it would stop them from being officially working members of the royal family. But I think that if they had already been, then they would
Mm.
have been in a much more difficult and precarious position than as they are
Yes.
now with not being. And so I think that it's been reported that they've cancelled any of their appearances that they were about to make in the near future. And I
Mm.
think that's wise because how as soon as they step out the door, they're going to be asked about their father and their mother and
Yes.
their associations and all of that. So I think that's wise. But I think, and while I think it is a very difficult situation for them,
Mm.
and it's going to be a difficult time for them, I think essentially the fact that they're not working members of the royal family does protect them to a degree. And
Yes.
so I think that they the best thing they can do is probably keep quiet for a while and then re-emerge a little bit
Yeah.
later
I
when
agree.
things have died down a bit.
I agree, and it does sound as if Charles and William, who I think are both quite close to Beatrice and Eugenie,
Mm. Well,
are keen to
certainly
protect
Beatrice
them.
was at Sandringham at Christmas last year because
Mm.
even though Andrew and Sarah didn't attend and Eugenie was reported to be abroad, you see, I was quite surprised because I thought that after her parents weren't going there,
Mm.
not that she should be banned from going to Sandringham,
Yeah.
but I did think that she might have spent Christmas with her parents as
Yeah.
opposed to going to Sandringham with the rest of the royal family. But no, she was there, and I remember because I did actually shake hands with her on Christmas morning because she, the
Ah.
members of the royal family walk down
Yes. Yeah.
from
Yeah.
church and then walk back. And I remember shaking hands and saying, Happy Christmas, Your Royal Highness. And then, because she was expecting a baby at the time, said, Oh,
Mm.
congratulations on the baby. And she said, Oh, thank you very much. I hope it doesn't arrive too soon.
Mm.
And she was, very charming. And the fact
Mm.
that she was still included in that family Christmas, despite the fact that her parents were
Yeah.
out in the cold, literally in every
Mm.
sense, it
Mm.
being December, that shows that there is a certain closeness between her and the King and the Prince of Wales, because they could easily have said, well, actually, we don't want you there as well, and they obviously didn't do that. But there's a difference between attending a family event like that and receiving public subsidy and carrying out duties on behalf of the state. And I think that because they don't, I think that protects them to a degree.
I I agree. I agree. I just hope that there is some sort of role for them in the future. Even and I don't mean as working royals, but just still being visible members of the royal family, because I think that the royal family does have a sort of slight generational gap at the moment, which
Mm.
they help fill quite nicely. We should talk about the future as we end. Now, James, I have a challenge for you. Not a challenge for you, a an offer for you, which is that I believe I have solved what I think the king should do next to head off the future problems that might likely arise, to help guard against unforeseen and unwanted political involvement, and to protect the reputation of the royal family, and finally, and most importantly, to give the best chance of justice being delivered that I think would be possible, although I don't know how possible that's ever going to be. Would you like to hear my plan?
I assume that's a rhetorical question because you're going to tell me anyway.
I am. I am. And then you can assess it. So, what I propose, because I do think we're probably going to need, I do think Parliament are going to feel they need to be involved in some way. But as I've said, I don't think it's appropriate for Parliament to act as judge, jury, an executioner in the way that they did in medieval times. So what I'm going to propose is that the following deal is made with Andrew, that he is told that he must petition Parliament formally for removal of his dukedom, his earldom, his barony, and for him to be eliminated in the line of succession. The reason that he is saying that he's doing this is, while still protesting his innocence, if that's what he wants, is he doesn't want there to be any feeling whatsoever that any law enforcement agency anywhere in the world can't act against him because he's in any way still seen as a member of the royal family. So he would like Parliament to formally revoke any status that he has through this bill that Andrew would petition them to pass. So the request comes from Andrew. This would then be drawn together as the Andrew Act of 2026 or whenever it would be passed. And as I say, it would formally strip him of his peerage titles and remove him from the line of succession, which does not need to compromise his daughter's place in the line of succession. And as a result, would by default remove him from ever acting as a councillor of state again. Although, if we wanted to put that in the bill, that would be fine as well. On the day that that act receives royal assent, the king would issue letters patent saying that on Andrew's request, by Andrew's request, he would like to formally relinquish the style of Royal Highness and the titular dignity of Prince of the United Kingdom, and that the king is therefore issuing letters to that effect. After that, Andrew will be known as Andrew Mountbatten, and it sends a signal that anyone that wants to move against him legally should not feel that they will embarrass the British state from doing so. What Andrew gets by agreeing to this deal is he retains his residency either at Royal Lodge or a similar place on Crown land or land owned by the king, even if it's not formally Crown land. It could be Highgrove, so that does have somewhere to live with a degree of dignity. He doesn't have to worry about that aspect of things. And he is also, of course, therefore under the surveillance of the royal family and the British state. That is my plan, my suggestion to the king. What do you think?
I think that as plans go, it's a rather good one. My only comment would be that, as we've already said, there's no bar with him being prince or duke or any of
Mm.
those things to legal
Yes,
proceedings against him. So I do think it is a victory of style over substance, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I
it's
think that
sending a
it
signal.
it is sending a signal. It's sending
Yeah,
a clear signal. I think that that's right, and I think that him surrendering the title of prince again would be a great sign. And I think that it would show that his because I think that at the moment, even though he does not have he's given up the use of the title Duke of York. There are still people out there saying, well, that's only, he could change his mind later. Well, I think it'd be very difficult for him to do that. But yes, you're right, he could. And he's still a
yeah.
prince. And so, still being a prince, he could still then play, even if he's not formally a working member of the royal family, he could, at some point down the line, attempt to play some part in public.
Hello, future Gareth here again. So, on the recording you've just listened to, I set out my plan for what I thought would be the best way of removing royal status from Prince Andrew in a way that didn't set up Parliament to act as judge, jury, and executioner in a way that I felt was inappropriate in a democratic state. And I maintain that these things are serious. I think it's very easy to think they're the little details that nobody cares about, but I think we take that attitude at our long term peril. Sorry to sound rather grave about it, but that is the sort of person I am. I think that the solution that we seem to have arrived at is reasonably good, primarily because it does avoid Parliament acting in a way I would deem inappropriate. Let me explain a little bit more of what I mean. Uh, the King has removed HRH and the title of Prince by letters patent. There are a number of people I've seen in comments saying that the King cannot do that, it's his birthright. That's not true. The King's always been able to remove the HRH tag and the Prince Princess dignity. I was going to say that's not controversial. It is, of course, controversial, but it is not unprecedented. So there's no issue about that. And while that can be seen as the king acting as judge, jury, and executioner in a way I would be uncomfortable with Parliament doing, it's actually quite different because the king is fundamentally the employer, if you like, of the royal family. And while Andrew has not been convicted of criminal offences, as I think James explores in the podcast you've been listening to, he has been dishonest and he has most certainly been very, very unwise. And he has dragged his employer, if you like, in terms of the monarchy, into disrepute. So it is entirely reasonable for them to remove those privileges from him, and those titles are privileges. I had an issue, as I have set out in the podcast, with Parliament acting to confiscate Andrew's property, and by that I mean his peerage titles, such as the Dukedom of York, given he has not been convicted or even tried for anything and had an opportunity to go through due process. What has happened is that rather than Parliament get involved, the the king has issued a royal warrant instructing the Lord Chancellor to remove Andrew from the role of the peerage. Now, I've had to do some research about this myself because I must confess to not being particularly familiar with what the role of the peerage is, and it's a relatively recent innovation in the history of peerages. It was introduced in 2004. The reason for that is that prior to 1999, hereditary peers had the right to sit and vote in the House of Lords. So the job of keeping a list as to who all the peers were, i.e., who died and had their sons inherited, who were their sons, what were their name, that was really done as part of the same process of the role of maintaining the roles of Parliament. It was a bit more complicated than that, but essentially that's what happened. Post 1999, when the vast majority of hereditary peers, all but 92, lost the ability to sit and vote in the House of Lords, that became much more complicated. So clearly by 2004, they decided they needed to introduce the role of the peerage basically to keep track of who all the peers were. And the rule was that when you inherit your peerage, effectively, or appointed to a peerage, you will not be able to use the precedence of a peer or be called by your title in official documents until you have registered and been added to that role. So, what the king has done by removing Andrew from that role is it means that it is now not just the king's suggestion that we don't call Andrew the Duke of York. It would now be wrong to call Andrew the Duke of York in official documents because he is not on the roll of the peerage. Clearly, this is an innovation in what the role of the peerage was designed for. It was about proving that you really did have a peerage, that you really had inherited one. Well, there can be no doubt that Andrew really has a peerage. We have the letters patent, and the world will watch as it was announced in 1986. So this is a novel use of it, and it does leave us in quite a legally ambiguous situation. I came across an article by a very knowledgeable man who I've not heard of before called Jason Locke, who has clearly studied this in depth. And his conclusion, which I wholeheartedly agree with, is that Andrew does remain a peer. He does still have the legal privileges of a peer, but post 1999, they are almost non-existent, so it really is only a technicality. However, he can now, not only will he not use that title at the king's request, he cannot be accorded the title or the precedence associated with the dukedom by law. So it's a very strange, ambiguous situation, but it's one I can live with. My only real objection was to Parliament intervening other than at Andrew's request, because as I've said, and I will keep saying, in a democratic society, a parliament should not set itself up to be judge, jury, and executioner when someone has not gone through due process. It does mean that people like me will occasionally still say, well, technically Andrew is still the Duke of York, we don't call him that, and it could be that that means there need to be further escalation. And in that case, I think it really would be a case of asking, as I suggested, Andrew to petition the Commons or the Lords to bring forward legislation to enable him to officially and legally relinquish the title. And I'm sure that if the circumstances were right, he could be so prevailed upon. What I would say is the King has done all he can do without the government effectively instructing Parliament or encouraging Parliament to pass legislation. And we know the government is reluctant to devote any parliamentary time to removing Andrew from the line of succession. They may well be, for quite good reasons, reluctant to devote parliamentary time to this as well. Anyway, I'll let you get back to the past. Well, I think we've had a pretty far-ranging conversation. I'm sure people have comments, so do please add those comments. If you're watching on YouTube, you can put them in directly into the comment section. If you want to get in touch with us, if you're listening to this on a podcast channel, you can do so by email royalhistorygeeks@gmail.com, or we are on pretty much all the social media. So find us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Royal History Geeks in one form or another, and you will find us. But until then, thank you for listening, James. Thank you for your time and your input. And may we encourage you to also listen to the Andrew Light October Royal Roundup.